Amateur radio as a hobby seems to appeal less to younger people in this modern age of social media, smartphones and the internet. But many decades ago, radio did have a large appeal to the younger audience. Boy Scout groups were active on the radio as early as the 1920s, and during the 1950s, 60s, 70s and 80s, many schools, colleges and universities had their own radio clubs, complete with club calls, shacks and lots of members. This is the story of the Umist Radio Society, one of the many radio clubs at the universities in Manchester, which received its licence back in 1957. Despite being active for many decades, there's very little information about the club, but through many sources I've traced the history of one of the largest of Manchester's forgotten university radio societies and managed to find the club's shack, but will there be anything left to see? All of these radio clubs are now long since defunct and there isn't much information about them on the internet, but one club shack is still in existence, albeit forgotten and sealed away. Using limited sources and speaking to the people who were involved in the clubs over the years, I've managed to piece together the story of these university amateur radio societies, which had quite a long and interesting life. Due to the amount of time that's passed, there's very little evidence remaining online that the clubs ever existed at all. And whilst there's more information about the Umist Club than others, such as the Victoria University of Manchester Club, I'm going to tell you the story as best as I can. The Umist Amateur Radio Society can be traced back to 1957, when an amateur sound licence was issued to G4TO to allow transmissions from its first club shack located on the top of the university's biochemistry building in room J18X. Before this, a radio station on the premises was used to train pilots during the Second World War. Despite this, records show that the call sign G3CXX was first issued in 1947 but was cancelled in 1952. This was then reissued to the club upon request in 1958. The first club constitution was established in early 1958, and a small but growing number of enthusiastic students showed interest in amateur radio and joined the Umist Amateur Radio Society. They started to gather equipment from late 1957 and wrote to numerous radio suppliers such as Panda Radio in Rochdale, and on October 28, 1957, a grant of £59 was authorised by the university to buy a Panda Cub transmitter. By February 1958, there was a homebrew transmitter in the shack which operated on 20 metres and 40 metres, along with another transmitter presented by Marconi's Wireless Telegraph Company Limited. By mid-1958, 3 licensed students belonged to the Radio Society: G3JAG, G3LZW and G3LHD. However, many students were showing interest in the group at the time, and their names were sent to the GPO for authorisation to use the shack's equipment. On the roof of the building was a 60-foot Versa tower, which housed antennas such as a tri-band quad, a G5RV and a 160-metre wire, which was put up between this building and an even taller building to the east. The Umist Club was still extremely active during the 1950s and 60s, and into the 1970s and 80s after the shack relocated to the Sackville Street building due to sharing its original space with cages that were used to house animals for testing at the time. By 1961, there were a large number of licensed amateurs who had joined the club, including 2 girls who were studying to become nuns. They wanted to join the society with a view to obtaining their licences so they could transmit when they went on a mission. However, by 1963, activity at the club had dwindled, leading to a recruitment drive, involving notices being put up around the university to attract new members. The transmitter station was rebuilt after a period of inactivity and became active once again. The club used various call signs over the years, and whilst the call signs Golf 3 Charlie X-Ray X-Ray and Golf 6 Charlie X-Ray X-Ray are now long since defunct, Golf 8 Foxtrot Oscar Tango is still registered to the Manchester University Institute of Science and Technology to this day. G3CXX and G6CXX were issued to D. Gordon Bagg, G4TO, and reassigned to Dr. Geoffrey F. Gott in 1973. A check of the 1992 RSGB call book shows that these call signs were still active, or at least assigned during the 1990s. GAFOT, which stood for Faculty of Technology, was also used for a while but lapsed in 1981. Students at the university entered many contests, and in the first top band contest of 1967, Umist scored 500 points, putting them in 14th place out of 47 contestants. Between September the 28th and October the 5th, 1969, Umist used the special event call sign GB3MAN to transmit from the university during Freshers' Week. On all bands, 10 metres to 160 metres, running AM, CW, SSB and RTTY. The operator of G3MAN for this contest was G3YMM, who was club secretary at the time. November the 7th and 8th, 1970 marked the annual Top Band Shortwave Magazine Club contests, and Umist entered. The magazine reported disqualification of G3CXX at the time, saying, "Having said all this, we now have to come to the nasty bit, disqualifications. This time the unlucky ones are Manchester University of Science and Technology, G3CXX. The trouble, once again, was the clicks, probably the same subtle reason for the same noises emanating from the same type of rig as was penalised last year. If G3CXX had looked at the back of the key jack, they would have probably found the 4.7 microfarad click suppressing capacitor making only intermittent contact due to the flexing of the spring leaf when the plug is put in or out. However, possibly remembering last year, G3CXX was told about the clicks a couple of days before MCC. Several stations made the required addition to the RST code during the contest QSOs, and lots of people complained. Sad indeed, as if they'd been radiating acceptable signals, they would have won by a clear margin of 500 points. However, there it is, and let us hope that all stations entering next year are inside the rules. The club entered and won the 1971 contest with 6,981 points, and noted 26 non-club contest QSOs during the event too, which proved how busy contests were back then. Consistently overstrong signals were suspect, however contestants made a declaration to follow the rules. The invigilators felt comfortable to accept G3CXX's strong signals, observing that this was down to the choice of two large antennas, one being a half-wave 150-foot wire above ground and a 300-foot semi-vertical with the far end 250 feet off the ground. Both were located on the Sackville Street building. The transmitter for the contest was a Code R85. Nevertheless, at the contest monitoring station in North Buckinghamshire, there were times when both GM3 TKV portable at 98 feet above ground and EI9 ONE using a half wave over a reservoir were even stronger than G3CXX. During the 1974 contest, Umist named themselves the Technical Institute Transmitting Society for the occasion. I'm sure you can work out the acronym for yourself. The name change was a protest against Shortwave magazine, with Birmingham University changing their name to Bums. They declared 310,000 points for the contest due to a mathematical error, however they in fact scored 28,160, putting them first. The radio of choice for this contest was a throttle-back KW Electronics KW2000A, with an amplifier in a 19-inch rack, again with a choice of the two aerials. Contest organisers remarked that G3CXX was well operated by G3YRU and G3ZSS. I can't pinpoint an exact date, but at some point during the late 1970s the original shack moved to the Sackville Street building that belonged to Umist. It appears that the club was inactive for a short time, with licence renewal fees not being paid. The club secretary set out on a mission to find information regarding the club and its call signs, and in 1980 a request was sent for information on the call signs registered to the university. In 1981, the call signs G3CXX and G6CXX were re-established for use by the Umist Radio Society. After the original shack moved to its new location, the club was operational and using the main beam on the roof of the building, which was used for VHF. There was also a 14-element J-beam parabeam used for 2-metre DXing. There were two operating desks in the new shack. One desk was used for HF with a Yaesu FT101E, a Kenwood TR9000 an amplifier, and an ATU. Another desk was used for VHF and UHF equipment. There was also a bookcase and filing cabinet in the main room. As technology moved forward, computers and other equipment were installed in the shack to allow packet data modes to be used. A storage room next door was used as a secondary shack, but later this became used for scrap equipment and unfinished and shelved projects. Numerous feeders enter both rooms from the skylights in the roof, and access to the roof next door allowed members to install, maintain and remove various antennas. Groups of students met in the Umist Student Union Bar on Thursday evenings and about once a month did some activities such as visit to a radio reality, a visit to BBC Radio Manchester and BBC Moorside Edge transmitter station, amongst others. The station was particularly active on Friday evenings, especially after members had met for drinks in the Students' Union below. One student was fascinated with HF SSB and often stayed in the shack all of Friday night working Grey Line DX such as USA at dusk and Australia at dawn. The Godley telescope is in the adjacent roof of the Umist building, and quite often he, an astronomer and the security guard would be the only people in the building all night. During 1980 to 1982, the main shack had a Yaesu FT101E transceiver with a 1 kilowatt amplifier into a HF beam and a HF long wire, which gave a capability of 1.8 megs to 30 megs. There was also a 144 MHz beam and collinear and a 433 MHz beam, as well as a 1.3 GHz transceiver with a small beam and transverter. At the club's peak in around 1982, there was around 100 members, and 60 to 70 of these members had radio licences. The shack keys used to be held at the Umist Security Gatehouse on Sackville Street, and you could sign them out upon producing an ID card. Interestingly, there's two small rooms on the roof of the Sackville Street building itself, accessible only via ladder and hatch. That's where Radio Rag lived. This was an entirely illegal student pirate radio station. The station operated with different configurations over the years, but generally on the north end roof was a 50 watt Readyphone mono transmitter on 88.6 MHz, as well as a 100 watt Pi stereo FM transmitter on 103 MHz, but we'll revisit Radio Rag in a future episode. Activity from the club wound down in the late 1980s, and there's no mention of it publicly after this time. Membership numbers dwindled in later years due to the declining popularity of amateur radio amongst younger people. Many members moved back to their hometowns and countries after graduating, and a lack of new members led to the club being disused, with the exception of a few members of staff. The most recent recollections of the club come from sometime in the early 1990s, where amateurs began to get packet radio type interference drifting across the conversations on 70cm FM, which turned out to be a faulty transmitter at the university. The packet transmission was on, for example, 433.625, and it seemed normal, but there was a pair of spurious sidebands as well, and they drifted across the band. They listened to the drifting signals and compared them with the non-drifting ones, and by timing their appearance they were able to identify the genuine transmission associated with the spurious drifting one. They then decoded the packets to get the call sign. The shack was inhabited for a period by Trafford Radio Group. However, during the mid-2010s, the last of the active radio amateurs at Umist Club retired, and the space was passed to a member of staff to look after. At this time, there was still a running packet service off the roof. There were plans to reinstate the shack and refurbish it back to its former glory, with a view to sparking up some interest in amateur radio at the university, which by this time was just known as Manchester University. This never happened due to the fact that only one student showed interest in the club, and that also in around 2016, at the time of the plans to reinstate the shack, it was broken into and vandalised. The damage to the equipment inside the shack was devastating. Numerous radios and antennas had to be disposed of, and this included wideband transceivers and receivers, and some antenna tuners which contained large glass envelopes which had been destroyed. There's still a cupboard on the roof which houses the remains of many antennas, and the shack room itself is in a state of disrepair, and as the building itself is marked for closure in the near future, there's no chance of it being revived. Victoria University of Manchester itself had a separate radio club which was run by G3XDY, with the club's call signs G3VUM as well as GAFUM, which had a shack next door to the Film Society on the top floor of the Students' Union building in Oxford Road. The call sign G3VUM was issued in 1967. The club shack fed a TH6 DXX 2015 and 10 metre beam on a short tower, and a top band dipole supported on a flagpole. The shack radio was a KW Electronics KW2000A. Not much is known nowadays about the Victoria University of Manchester Club Shack, although in 1972 they took a trip to the Isles of Jura and Islay at the beginning of July. They ran high power CW and SSB on 2 metres, and they also operated on 4 metres and 70 centimetres. The call sign used was GB2UM, as well as GM3VUM/P, which was on the side of the minibus they hired. Between June the 23rd and July the 2nd, 1967, G3VUM Portable operated 0.1 MHz from St Agnes in the Isles of Scilly on AM and CW. The club had a special event QSL card made for the event. In 1968, Manchester University had a KW2000A, a lattice tower on which to hang an aerial, and the new shack, but the shack lacked a mains power supply. It's interesting to note that this group were able to admit a limited number of members from outside the university as well. The Victoria University Club operated the special event station GB2UM from the Students' Union between September the 30th and October the 5th, 1984. A presentation about amateur radio and an accompanying video was shown during this period, so the club may have disbanded sometime during the late 1980s. Incidentally, there was a third student radio club in Manchester. This one was at Salford University and had the club calls G4GSU and G6GSU. There's no record of this radio society today, but the shack was at Castle Irwell Students' Hall of Residence, which used to be a racecourse. The shack was in the old racecourse commentators tower, which was the highest building on the site, which is now derelict. Today, the Umist shack at the Sackville Street building lies empty, unused and locked shut. There's little chance of the club ever being reinstated, and the room itself is deteriorating rapidly. The Victoria University shack room has been repurposed, and the club and call sign are both defunct, and the Salford Club shack has long since been demolished. The call sign is registered Silent Key, and the club itself doesn't exist anymore. So, that's the story of the good old days of university amateur radio societies around Manchester, and how many people enjoyed a growing, exciting and diverse hobby that thrived and became an early form of social media for university students. It's really sad that there's little trace of the clubs and that radio doesn't appeal to young people today as it did decades ago. It seems unlikely that this will ever change, and as time goes by, student amateur radio societies will just become another part of the history of our hobby.